Do you avoid phone calls, small talk, public speaking, or other social situations because of anxiety? If so, how do you know whether or not you might have social anxiety or high functioning social anxiety? In this episode, I'll share the signs and symptoms of social anxiety along with high functioning social anxiety, along with some tips to help you cope with both. This is episode number 126, High Functioning Social Anxiety. What is it and what can you do about it? Welcome to Calmly Coping. My name is Tati Garcia and I'm a licensed therapist and coach specializing in high functioning anxiety. I help high achievers overcome high functioning anxiety so they can feel calm, balanced, and confident from within. If this topic interests you, then please like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you get notified whenever I release a new episode. Thank you so much for tuning in. So first, what is social anxiety? So I'm going to refer to the DSM-5 criteria. So the DSM is the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual. So it is basically the place where psychologists, psychiatrists, therapists, mental health professionals go in order to provide a mental health diagnosis for somebody. It's the whole book of all mental health diagnoses. So I just want to provide a disclaimer. Just because you can resonate with certain criteria from a diagnosis does not necessarily mean that you have this diagnosis. It's important to see a qualified mental health professional in order to receive a diagnosis. So I'm not going to go over all the criteria, but just the main ones when it comes to social anxiety disorder. So first, we have marked fear or anxiety about one or more social situations in which the individual is exposed to possible scrutiny by others. So examples include social interactions like having a conversation, meeting unfamiliar people, being observed, eating or drinking, and performing in front of others like giving a speech. So basically being in a social situation causes you anxiety because you're afraid that other people are going to judge you. Another criteria is that you fear that you will act in a way or show anxiety symptoms that will be negatively evaluated, so that you're going to be humiliated or embarrassed, or you're going to be rejected by others, or you're going to offend others. And these social situations that you fear almost always provoke fear or anxiety. And these social situations are avoided, or if they're not avoided, they're endured with pretty intense fear or anxiety. And it's often out of proportion to the actual threat posed by the social situation. So it's not necessarily proportionate, or it's not necessarily a rational response to be super anxious to the point of being having intense anxiety when you are having a conversation with somebody, for example, because you're not in any actual threat or danger for the most part in that situation. Typically, it's something that's long lasting, could be 6 months or more. And the one criteria that separates social anxiety disorder and the diagnosis from high functioning social anxiety is that the fear, anxiety, or avoidance causes clinically significant distress or impairment in social, occupational, or other important areas of functioning. So the reason why I point this out as being the difference between the diagnosable disorder and the high functioning social anxiety is similar for the difference between generalized anxiety disorder and high functioning anxiety. So what often categorizes or qualifies something to be a disorder, mental health disorder, is that it has to have a negative impact on your day-to-day functioning and get in the way of you doing things that are important for you to survive, to live your life, to build relationships with others. And many times the high functioning part means that you're actually doing very well, and people may not necessarily know that you're struggling. And so this can be the case for high functioning social anxiety. So you may be hiding these struggles within, and other people may not necessarily know that you're struggling with social anxiety because of that, because you're not outwardly showing it, because you don't appear to be anxious, or because you're not talking about it. And at the same time, you are actually doing pretty well when it comes to being hardworking, being successful, and doing well in maybe certain social interactions. In my opinion, I think that when it comes to social anxiety, what I have noticed a lot is that when there are structured versus unstructured social interactions. So when it's the case where it is a work situation and it's very structured and you need to talk about a specific topic, or there's a specific purpose, that can be a situation that you may do well in depending on what it is. Let's say if it's like presenting in public or in a meeting, it may be a little different. You might feel more anxious. But if it's like a one-on-one interaction, and again, I'm making generalizations because this is really going to be different and unique for each and every person, what kind of situations cause anxiety for you. But in general, it may be the more unstructured social interactions, like having small talk by the water cooler, quote unquote, or going to a happy hour after work, or talking to the cashier during the checkout. Those kinds of unstructured social interactions may be the ones that might bring up more social anxiety, but those tend to be the more optional types. So if you're high functioning, you may be able to manage and get by with avoiding those kind of unstructured ones and maybe doing really well in the structured ones. So again, these are all generalizations, but maybe, if you can identify with some of this, then that can help to give you a starting place to understand what is important for you to focus on when it comes to trying to decrease the anxiety you feel in social situations. So now I'm going to share a few more signs and symptoms that you might experience if you struggle with either social anxiety or high functioning social anxiety, now that I've kind of explained the difference more so. So some other situations might be trying to control social situations. So this can look like trying to control yourself and the way you say things and the way you appear to others in order to elicit a certain sort of response, or trying to control social situations in any other way. It could be that you are afraid of being embarrassed, or you're afraid of looking awkward in social situations. You might assume that people are judgmental and that they're always thinking negatively about you. And that avoidance is a big piece. So you might avoid certain social situations entirely, or you might use an alternate form of communication, which now with technology is more accessible. So maybe you're going to send an email instead of having a phone call if getting on the phone makes you feel anxious. Or maybe you're going to order your food through an app versus getting on the phone. So there may be certain alternatives you use, and it's not to say that just because you use these alternatives you have social anxiety, but if you're avoiding these alternatives because it brings up fear and anxiety for you, and because you're like, I feel uncomfortable with this, or I don't know what's going to happen, or I'm afraid of something awkward or uncomfortable happening, or people judging me, or whatever it might be, then that can be a sign that it's coming from a place of feeling anxious in that social interaction. Another thing is you might fear that other people will notice your anxiety. So maybe they might notice that, oh, you're really not good at conversations or small talk, or see your flaws, or notice that you made a mistake, or anything else like that, or notice visible signs of your anxiety, like blushing or hands shaking or breathing rapidly, or any of those other physical signs that you're afraid may show up and be apparent to other people. Fear of failure can also feed into this. So if you're afraid of failure, you might be afraid of what other people are going to think of you if you make a mistake in a situation, if you fail, if you don't do well, how they might judge you. This will be especially apparent in, let's say, a public speaking situation or performance. And another big sign is often ruminating about past social interactions. So this could be like something happens and then you overthink it. So you might think things like, I shouldn't have said that. Why did I look so stupid there? Or what are they going to think of me? Or running over conversations over and over again in your mind, trying to kind of remember, oh, did I say anything weird in this conversation? Or that could have been misinterpreted, or things like that, kind of running over things in your mind, which is that rumination. You might also try and do what you can to be liked by others. So you might either hold back and not say things that could be potentially controversial or offensive, and not share your opinion because you're afraid that other people won't like you. And another sign that can happen is having brain fog or difficulty thinking clearly because of the anxiety and the overthinking. You might also be a people pleaser and have a fear of asking for help. And these can all be signs of social anxiety, but they're not necessarily exclusive to social anxiety, but it's really what I had described previously in the episode that kind of is the foundation. And then these other things you might notice as signs depending on your personal situation. I personally used to struggle with social anxiety. It still comes up from time to time, but it's definitely not as bad as it was before. And here are some examples of what that looked like for me personally. So I would avoid small talk as much as possible because I felt like I hate small talk. I'm not good at small talk. So when I worked in an agency, I would kind of stay locked in my office and not talk to people unless I had a specific reason to talk to them. You know, I felt uncomfortable talking on the phone and things like that, or talking to a cashier at a checkout line. If they start a conversation, then I'd feel this pressure to like say this like super interesting thing or things like that. And those are things that I've also heard from clients that I've worked with who struggle with social anxiety, very similar thoughts and worries in those types of situations. I also would always assume others were judging me or thinking negatively about me, or if I said something that I thought was stupid or made a mistake, that they would be really focusing on that and think something negative about me. That would then turn into that rumination of, oh, what did I say? What might they have thought about this? I'm happy to say that those kinds of things don't really happen anymore. And if they do, it's not as bad as it was before, but I can definitely understand what that feels like and how uncomfortable it is. And sometimes the overthinking things after the fact can be one of the hardest parts, in addition to obviously feeling anxious in the social situations themselves. Now that I've talked a little bit more about what social anxiety and high functioning social anxiety look like, now let's talk about how you can cope with them. First, I want to quickly share the sponsor for this episode. So it is my free training on how to overcome high functioning anxiety. So if you resonate with having high functioning anxiety, being high achieving on the outside and struggling with anxiety, overthinking, and overwhelm on the inside, then this training is perfect for you. So I'm going to walk you through the 3 key things that you need to know in order to overcome high functioning anxiety in 90 days. You can get access to that workshop by going to calmlycoping.com/workshop. And it is an on-demand workshop, so you can watch it whenever works for your schedule. Now let's talk about my 4 steps for how to cope with social anxiety and high functioning social anxiety. So step 1 is to acknowledge it. So I want you to identify and acknowledge, maybe I'm struggling with some anxiety in social situations. Even if you don't necessarily meet the criteria and say I have social anxiety disorder, that doesn't mean that you may not necessarily have anxiety in certain social situations. And what can help is to identify what are the specific social situations for you. Because like I said before, it's going to be different for every person. So maybe it's, I hate small talk, or I feel really uncomfortable when I go to parties where I don't know anybody, or I feel really uncomfortable walking around my neighborhood because I think people are looking out their window and judging me, or I feel really uncomfortable talking to coworkers or meeting my partner's family members, or whatever it might be. So identify for you, looking at your past behavior, looking at your present behavior, what are those situations that bring up that anxiety for you in social situations, and what are the ones that you tend to avoid? So if you find yourself avoiding certain things, avoiding making phone calls, avoiding going to certain social events, avoiding public speaking, or calling out sick on a day where you're supposed to do something that requires some form of social interaction, really look at what you're avoiding, because that can really be a clue as to what's causing you anxiety. And also looking like, is it with certain types of people? Is it with strangers? Is it with people that are in a position of power? So like supervisors? Is it with people that maybe you know well that you feel anxious? So for the most part, for most people, it tends to be with strangers and with people in positions of power, but it can be with anybody. So really identifying for you personally what type of people or what type of interactions brings up that anxiety for you. And then step 2 is going to be to shift your mindset, because there are a lot of negative beliefs that really feed into and reinforce that social anxiety. So I'm going to talk about a few right now. So first, look at your thoughts and really assess if you're judging yourself. Are you really terrible at conversations? If you feel like that's the case, look at your personal relationships, your friendships, your family members. Are they really saying that you're terrible at conversations? And even if they are, I'm sure that there's plenty of positive interactions you've had with people, and you can draw from that in order to combat and challenge these negative thoughts you're having about yourself. Another example of shifting your mindset is to look at, are people really focusing on that one mistake you made? Are people really focusing on your flaws? Because oftentimes we tend to exaggerate them ourselves. So if you've ever had acne, I'm sure you've had the experience where maybe you have like a zit or multiple ones on your face, and you think, oh my God, this is huge. People are only going to be able to look at this, when in reality, most people either won't notice it or it won't be as crazy or significant as you're personally making it out to be. And that's the case with anything, pretty much. So oftentimes we make the negative things that we do or we perceive about ourselves out to be so much bigger in our minds than other people do, because other people are really just more focused on themselves the same way that you're focused on yourself. So if you can create that mindset shift and recognize that people aren't picking apart every little thing you do and say, and they're more focused on themselves, that can help to give you some perspective in those situations. Another example is looking at what's the worst that could happen if you feel embarrassed or you say something that you think is stupid in a situation. Most times it might be a little uncomfortable in the moment, but it's gonna pass. People are gonna forget about it and people are gonna move on. Step 3 is to step outside of your comfort zone. So this is to practice taking little steps towards facing your fears. Don't do something that's a huge jump, like going from being terrified of public speaking to performing in front of like 500 people, but something that's going to be a little smaller baby steps, because that's going to help you to face what's making you feel anxious. And anytime you can face a fear, you are deactivating that fear and that anxiety, and you're teaching yourself, I can handle this, I can do this, and that's going to help to bring down those anxiety levels. So for example, that could be, making a phone call to order food instead of placing an order in the app, or calling somebody on the phone that you tend to text, or saying hi to a neighbor and making eye contact with them. Or maybe it's making small talk and saying, how are you doing, with the cashier at the checkout line. So these small little things can help you to feel more confident and comfortable, and help you realize that not every social interaction needs to be a performance. It needs to be this huge thing, but you can do it and it can be no big deal. This is actually what helped me a lot. So I started to just make small talk more in situations, even though it felt uncomfortable. And once I started to see like, wow, I'm really not as awkward as I thought I was, then it helped me to feel more confident in building up my skills to start to interact in more social situations. And at the end of the day, social interactions and communication are just skills. So they're skills that you can learn. So you can look up how to start small talk, how to start conversations with people. And if you can teach yourself these things, then this knowledge is going to help you to learn those skills, because it's not something that's necessarily genetic. I mean, obviously there is the personality component of conversation, but there is also the learned part. And so that's what you can focus on when it comes to starting to feel more comfortable in these social situations. And step 4 is to savor the positive. So by this, I mean, every time you take action outside of your comfort zone, celebrate your wins, reward yourself, be kind to yourself, and recognize that you're making progress, because every little step helps to move you closer towards long-term change. And this can also be recognizing your strengths when it comes to social interaction. So maybe you feel uncomfortable in certain situations, but you're really good when it comes to, for example, like one-on-one conversations or providing support to a friend or something like that. Or maybe you're really good at talking to children. Whatever it might be, really focus on your strengths, because every single person has flaws and insecurities, and that's okay. It's about not allowing those insecurities to hold you back from really opening up and connecting with the world and the people around you. So your action tip for this episode is to practice one of these tips every day or every few days. So to go over the tips again, step number 1 is to acknowledge it. And this can happen by journaling about your high functioning social anxiety. Step number 2 is to practice shifting your mindset and challenging those fears and worries. Step 3 is to practice gradually stepping outside of your comfort zone with baby steps. And step 4 is to savor the positive, your progress, and your strengths. Let's continue the conversation. I'd love to hear your thoughts. You can join me in my free Facebook community for high achievers with high functioning anxiety, Calmly Coping. And let me know, what is your biggest struggle with social anxiety? You can join that group by going to calmlycoping.com/group. And while you wait for next week's episode, I have other episodes about decreasing anxiety, adopting a healthy mindset, and managing your time and energy. So you can check out those episodes here. Thank you so much for tuning in today. And until next time, be calm.